So you went to Milwaukee for this piece. Can you remind or tell everybody why? What happens in Milwaukee?
A lot of things are happening in Milwaukee, and unfortunately, most of the media hasn't reported it. A lot of the mainstream media hasn't been there and covered the economic devastation that is occurring and that has been occurring for Black Milwaukeeans for about 40 years now, primarily deindustrialization. And when we think about deindustrialization and the working class and the Midwest particularly, and blue-collar voters, we tend to think of white people. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to write this piece to push back on that narrative, not only because it is fair and just, because we need to talk about those who are most economically devastated, but because it's the smart thing to do if we're talking about elections. And in 2016, while the pervasive narrative was that white working class voters or white conservative leaning voters flipped a lot of those states to Trump, because for instance, in Wisconsin, it went red for the first time in about 30 years for a president. However, when you look at the data, you realize that it's really a story of non-voters. 2016 was a story of non-voters. And I wanted to go down there and find out why. And it really surprised me the extent of the economic upheaval that Black people have been facing down there for decades.
So we're going to get to how the historical origins of that in a second. But that reminded me, I mean, there was that New York Times piece that came out within, I think, like a week of 2016.
Yep.
And I talked about it on Majority Report because it seemed just like this is the lane to go. Like, because even if you're talking about any voter that didn't show up or any voter that felt so betrayed by Democratic politics because of trade agreements, because of attacks on government spending, because of not campaigning in your state, that instead of like this flip of like disentangling why somebody would vote for Trump, which I think now, at least in my opinion, I mean, I don't know, most people voted for Trump are Republicans, and Republicans vote Republican. This isn't really that complicated, right?
Absolutely.
But why did the turnout depress itself? And if you look at that interview, if I recall correctly, you had a lot of people saying essentially some combination of, you know, which I think people shouldn't ignore, which is like Obama's a compelling person, so I might go out and vote for Obama as a guy, but legislatively not much was happening for me. Hillary didn't really say anything different than Obama, and she's not that compelling, so I'm not going out. And I think what you did in the piece definitely knows you went to this much broader history behind it. So can you talk, like, first of all, just bluntly, I think when people think of Wisconsin, they don't think of a particularly Black place. Yeah. They think of a highly white place, but it is, in fact, a very African-American, very Black place. How did that happen? What is the Great Migration? When did people start leaving the South to go there? And what kind of economy did that create?
So that history is very compelling. I just want to add on to what you're saying with Trump, because that is a key reason why I wanted to write this piece, because when you look at the voter data, the folks who voted for Trump was about the same ratio as those who voted for Mitt Romney and George Bush and John McCain and literally every other Republican president since Nixon. So I talk about that in the piece as well, because that to me is not really much of a story. If you are a party that serves white interests, the majority of white people tend to vote that in that direction. So what's new? And so that's why Milwaukee and Wisconsin was so compelling to me, because it said something different. And part of what was so different about it is thinking of the idea of the Black voter and thinking that they are a monolith. So what we saw in the Hillary campaign, and I think the general narrative around Black voters, is that, you know, we are in the South. This is the Democratic firewall. Right. And you get through them through some of these cultural appeals. Bill Clinton, as we know, used quite a bit of that when he was running in his earlier campaigns. So that's what we think about typically when we think about the Black voter.
So it's like I'm ready to go to church.
Right. You go to church, you talk about Beyonce, talk about Jay-Z, which is precisely what Hillary Clinton did. And if you talk to some Black Milwaukeeans, like, they saw right through that, and they felt that it was so patronizing and they were insulted by it. Mm-hmm. So what the piece initially started off with me wanting to think about the Midwest more broadly. And it was to discuss the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the 1967 uprising. So there was a lot of civil unrest under very similar social...
In Milwaukee.
In Milwaukee and throughout the country.
Right.
in a lot of cities where Black people had migrated because they didn't see any of those civil rights gains that they had been promised. So in 67 in Watts in California, in Newark, in Detroit, in Milwaukee, all over the place, you saw these uprisings, a lot of civil unrest. And there was arson, there was, I mean, just everything that you envision when you think about, what a riot or a rebellion would look like in an urban environment. So I went to Milwaukee and Detroit. So the piece was really going to be about Detroit, but I was like, everyone talks about Detroit. So let's see what's going on in Milwaukee. And that uncovered so much for me. So just pushing back again on this narrative that Black people are a monolith. In the Midwest, there is such a rich tradition of anti-establishment Black politics. There is a rich tradition of progressive politics, of collective bargaining. A lot of the things that we think about when we think of progressive politics was actually born in Wisconsin, and Black people adopted that as well. And they were also bringing some of their own tradition coming from the Deep South, where, they were escaping Jim Crow segregation and this really entrenched legal system of discrimination and terrorism. So if you've got this group of people who are already kind of anti-establishment because they're, uprooting their entire lives and moving
and willing to take big risks.
Huge risk. They don't know people. They don't have a network there for the most part. They're willing to uproot their lives. So there's already this culture of being a little bit anti-establishment. And we don't really talk about it enough. So just one more bit on the history with that. And then I guess we could talk about the history of, the economic decline.
Yeah. But first, but they're leaving because there's also the perception, and it's not all wrong. You outlined this, that actually in the 60s and the 70s, there's the fact that it's not living up to the promise of civil rights at all, but there is actually a great job market.
Right.
And there are actually industrial jobs, and that actually feeds into working Black middle class through blue collar, just like the same way that we think of with white workers in the industrial Midwest. And that also feeds again into this politics of labor, which is another difference from the South, right? Because it's like there isn't this labor union politics in the South, because they were crushed as actually part of that same apartheid economic system that people are getting away from.
Yeah, and I think a good central figure, so I framed the piece around some, folks who represent different walks of life, different generations, but they are integral to the kind of cultural and political fabric of Milwaukee. And one of those men is a man by the name of Wendell Harris. And he was the former union president of the Black Trade Unionists, also a Democratic Socialist. And here's an older Black dude, Democratic Socialist, and has been for years. And I think what's really interesting about that is a lot of folks in his generation came from Arkansas. So they were familiar with Bill Clinton. So there was also this Clinton, anti-New Democratic tradition that was going on at the same time, because he saw what was going on in Arkansas under Bill Clinton's governorship. He saw what the corporate tax breaks were doing. He saw what the union busting was doing in Arkansas. He was like, oh no, I'm not about that here.
Right.
And so that collective bargaining was a big part of what Black men experienced in the Midwest. Black men occupied about 54% of the Black male population at the time in 1970 were in manufacturing jobs versus 21% of white men in Milwaukee. So the majority of Black men relied on, the manufacturing industry to make a living, where, white folks had more options. The market was a little bit more diverse for them. So when you take that away from them, then you see a lot of the trends that, that are occurring right now in terms of the economic impacts.
Yeah, and you quoted some incredible statistics, at the heart of this sort of industrial economy, Black male employment in Wisconsin is higher than the national average of employment for everybody.
Yes.
And then it sinks just catastrophically low.
Yeah, the Black male jobless rate is about 50% in Milwaukee, and it's it's been at that rate for about 10 years. So since the Great Recession, basically.
I want to compare actually Bill and Hillary Clinton, I think, in turn, because it helps your piece, I think, and sort of understanding this conversation, at least for me, because my understanding of Bill Clinton was sort of like he was doing basically three things. That's a super Bill Clinton way of formulating, right? I was doing three things. So number one.
Was that a Bill Clinton accent I heard?
It was a little bit.
Okay.
A little bit. If I have a few more beers in me, I'll get you.
I'm ready.
I'll do the whole
post game. We'll do an SNL thing.
I'll do the whole post game as Bill Clinton.
Okay.
Don't worry about it. So move the Democratic Party to the right, get corporate campaign contributions. And this is like coming out of the 80s and actually even Carter, right? Like they're already deregulating the airline and busing industries, and he's part of the Democratic Leadership Council, which gets all this corporate money to back trade agreements and deregulate finance and blah, blah, blah. Then on the other hand, he is actually moving in some ways paradoxically more so than at least in 92. He actually did talk about things like universal health care, so there was a little bit of like a populist thing. But the other part of the populist thing was like the types of racialized politics that would shock the type of woke people you see on Twitter who stand for the Clintons all the time, right? Like the same people who, if Bernie Sanders is like, yeah, I used the wrong pronoun, they would be like, yeah, Bernie's canceled. These people, like Bill Clinton made it his business to go home to execute a mentally disabled black man when he was running for president to talk about welfare. I know you're going to go off on this in a second.
I'm going to try not to. I don't want to go off.
You have absolutely, you can do whatever you feel. And then at the same time, there was this other, and also to me, I think even like 20 years later, as we're adults, reads like super patronizing, like Bill Clinton's the first black president. Bill Clinton, he plays the saxophone and he's cool and all of this shit. And then you fast forward to Hillary Clinton, and you actually have essentially the same sort of like political profile, but the social signaling flips. So we go from like, I'll tell you what, like here, I'll do a full one. Black people need to work, and I should, and I'll play the sax for you, but you need to be a father. Mm-hmm. And then Hillary Clinton's like, it's called intersectionality. And then meanwhile, like, here's Beyonce, here's intersectionality.
Yeah, some hot sauce.
No jobs.
Yeah.
Go fuck yourself.
Yeah.
And in both of those things is concealing the economics and concealing structural racism. And in both of those strategies, this type of Midwest populist African-American politics is completely negated. Is that how you'd frame it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that framing is essentially, I believe, what I argue is that it cost her the election. So the black vote in Milwaukee, or I should say Wisconsin generally, went from they lost 88,000 black voters. I'll just put it that way.
How much of that is voter suppression, just to like be fair to put that in the mix?
It's hard to tell. And I think, my argument is that at least in 2016 in Wisconsin, there's more evidence saying that it was voter disinterest over voter suppression. Mm-hmm. I think voter suppression, just to back up, is obviously a key issue right now. It's critical that we get a hold of that and that we hold both Democrats and Republicans accountable for that. I'm from Georgia, so I see what's happening right now with Stacey Abrams. That kind of suppression has been happening in the South for decades. Literally, the first election that I was able to vote in, there was an intense amount of voter suppression. It was between Cynthia, I don't know if you remember, this is kind of back in the day. I'm probably a little bit older than people may think. At least I like to think I am. And we had a congresswoman named Cynthia McKinney who was running. She was like saying, George
Matt
Bush.
has a crush on Cynthia McKinney.
Oh, word?
I'm not sure if you're...
You don't even know what she looked like.
No, she does.
Okay. So
I know what she looks like because of Matt.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, her pictures are all around here, guys. Y'all just can't see it.
It is. Matt has a shrine to Tupac and Cynthia McKinney. It's very interesting. I'm sorry to put your business out like that. All right, go ahead.
And so she was my congresswoman,
right.
And we saw how Republicans basically ousted her because she was the one, questioning. I think they might have talked about her in 9/11. I don't remember, but anyway, we saw this happening.
She was a little extra at times.
But
she was a good congresswoman.
We need people who are going to push back. So she pushed back. She was asking about, what happened with 9/11. We need to ask questions, basically. And so because we have open, primaries in Georgia,
right.
Republicans found a way to kick her out. And
they replaced her with somebody
Denise
really
Majette,
trash, right?
Yeah, she was there for like one term and then hasn't been heard of since. So it's clearly there to basically get Cynthia McKinney out. They needed somebody more centrist.
Got it.
So anyway, voter suppression is key. And I think we need to also be aware of when we are oppressing people who are poor, who are working class, in and out of elections. So not just in an election cycle should we be worried about people who are under oppressive conditions. We need to speak to those issues. And unfortunately, a lot of times Democrats don't do that. Or I should say mainstream Democrats don't. And that's not what happened in Wisconsin. Hillary Clinton didn't step foot in Wisconsin. Most people will tell you that after she became a nominee. She did not speak to the 50% black male unemployment. There was an uprising there in 2016 in August, just a few months before the general election.
Talk about that. What led to that? You described this really well in the piece as well.
So in a neighborhood called Sherman Park, there was a group of folks who were fed up. And the reasons for that are myriad. The match point was the killing of a young man named Sybil Smith. He was killed by a police officer, like cold blood. There are videos that circulated. And just in a few hours, the city was in flames. So I spoke with Alderman Khalif Rainey, who was there. It was his district where he saw this happening. He said it was the most chilling thing he's ever experienced in his life because it was just anarchy. He didn't know, what his neighborhood was going to look like the next day because he grew up in a neighboring district, and now this was his district. And to see it go down when, especially historically, it was there for like kind of black middle class. Like that was the Sherman Park was an area that you aspired to live in one day. And to see it decimated, he was baffled, and he also felt completely powerless. And imagine you just gotten elected. This is your district, and you have absolutely no control over this because these things have been building up for decades. If you imagine, from literally just 1 hour to the next, something is completely in flames. What else is going on there? So if you are an elected official, you think you would at least ask why. And to be an elected official of a state that you need to win and you don't even step foot in that state, it speaks to, I think for a lot of people, a lack of, just no sense of like, I guess, understanding or no sense of reality about the real conditions people are experiencing.
Right. I mean, it kind of reminds me, I know I'm always going to do Brazil examples, but this actually is appropriate because I talked with a friend once about basically when they impeached Dilma Rousseff, right, who's the successor to Lula, who I'm always talking about on this show because I consider him to be a political prisoner. And I said, but do you think like if Lula was president, even with all of the corruption, all of these people gunning at the Workers' Party, would he have managed to survive? And he's like, yeah, he really probably would have. And part of it was, he showed me this clip of this interview where Lula, like in the heart of this crisis, with all this austerity happening, was like, the first thing we've got to do is to get credit and investment circulating back into like people's hands. Like, all this other stuff is noise compared to like getting the money now. And if you follow that instinct, people will come to you. So like you have all of these people in the article who get it, who are organizers, who are politicians, who are part of the party, who are part of even the NAACP, which is definitely not, in my read in modern politics, a radical force at all. So was it that the Clinton campaign not only didn't campaign there, but it didn't even have like any relationship with any of the actors on the ground there? And if so, like, is that changing at all?
From my reporting and speaking to Fred Royal, who is the president of the NAACP Milwaukee chapter, he said that her ground game was atrocious. I followed up with an interview with Angela Lang. She is executive director or president of an organization called Black Leaders Organizing for Communities. She also spoke to the lack of real, just substantive organizing in those communities. And again, this is organizing that you're going to need not just, a month before the election, right, but just having a presence. And it doesn't seem like the Democratic leadership in the state or in the city really understood that. Most of the community organizers, of course, like they see it every day. And there was less kind of finger pointing and vilifying people for not wanting to be engaged, and saying, what are the substantive economic policies that you're going to bring forward to excite people? Just again, to shout out Georgia, that's something that Stacey Abrams has been doing. And so I want to mention her too, because I think that's an excellent contrast between what's been happening in 2016 and what can happen in the near future, if we're looking at, you know, ways to look ahead for progressives and for Black people, and to resolve some of these economic insecurities that they're experiencing. She excited people, but she didn't just excite them by saying, hey, I'm a Black lady, vote for me. She was going around these communities and saying, we need a living wage. I'm going to expand Medicare. We're going to bring collective bargaining to Georgia, which is something you don't do in Georgia. It's a right to work state. It's Republican controlled. So they were framing her as radical, and she was deliberately positioning herself against a white Democratic candidate who she easily could have kind of pandered to the center, because she's already Black. So that's radical. And just being a Black woman, natural hair, that's radical enough. But she didn't back down. And despite having, you know, a more centrist white candidate, she blew her away in the primaries. So I think that is like a good next step to have. And, you know, there is this kind of contrast between what's happening in Democratic national leadership, I think the mainstream, you know, machinery, versus what's happening with people who identify as Democrats, but they kind of operate independently from whatever their platform might be.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to what extent, like, I've gotten really annoyed with this class versus identity debate, because I just think it's stupid, and I don't think it really answers anything. Right?
Yeah, it is. My only concern right now is, I feel like, and I want to run this by you, is I feel like, okay, there's no doubt that following the Clinton campaign, that there's people, whether they're mediocre mainstream pundits or whether they're overcompensated mediocre Democratic consultants, and whether it's because they're, you know, running campaigns that rely on corporate money, or they're just insulated media professionals that have no connection to real life, they're very happy to run this scenario out, which is like, it's all a limited set of identity issues, and discussing economics and class is, you know, a distraction, or you're really just like, you know, I don't know, Bernie bro or whatever. On the other hand, which I have been called, by the way.
I'm sure you have.
Okay, you guys, calm down. Anyway.
That's why I had you on the show. I only have Bernie bro.
Yeah.
Guests.
It's a reunion.
Yeah. We only have. Yeah, I remember when, I shouldn't say this, but we met we were participating in a targeted harassment campaign on Twitter together.
Yeah.
I remember,
I remember that very clearly.
Yeah, Malaika was, she was sending screenshots of Malcolm X to Amanda Marcotte, and it was very triggering.
Yeah.
But, one love. But then on the other hand, I think that there are some people that have taken, on the flip side, they've sort of skipped what your reporting illustrates, which is, regardless of political strategy, what this country needs is social democracy, period. And basically 99% need it. But in fact, disproportionately, people of color need it. And there's no contradiction between that and dealing with policing and anything to do with justice and emancipation. And I think that some people, by getting so fixated on this like mythical Trump voter that is more like in their heads than in reality, like they're like, oh, we're going to go and we're going to talk to some Trump voter who has like a swastika, and then we're going to say, but what about free college? And then all of a sudden they're going to like put on Pete Seeger music and hug us. And it's like, that's not what's happening. Most Trump voters are absolutely motivated by race, xenophobia, gender, and they are doing white identity politics because that's the Republican Party. And somehow I just like, can we just like cut a lane where it's like, don't worry about all of these bullshit, you know, Democrat, technocratic people who are going to use identity politics to undermine progress or knock off Caldor identity politics. But then on the other hand, don't fall into the trap of romanticizing this Trump voter or arguing against identity politics in a way that toxifies our brand as leftists. You know, that's what worries me.
Yeah. I have nothing that I need to add, but I will add to it, because
add
that's
everything.
perfect.
Yeah.
That's literally kind of been my stance. I get it. All of us are suffering under capitalism. There's no doubt about it. We have tried to, by we, I mean just the general, I consider myself radical. The radicals and the leftists have been trying to
convince. The Bernie bros, if you will.
Have been trying to convince, racist white people of that for centuries, probably. And I think a lot of them like being racist. I think they enjoy the sense of power that it gives them to feel that they've got, some sort of hold over another demographic. That's just how their minds work. At the same time, again, because capitalism does involve all of us and it implicates everyone, how do we navigate that? And I think that is a little bit tricky, but we've got more than enough Black people who are suffering, more than enough non-racist white people who voted for Obama, like legit voted for Obama, who probably, just stuck out this last election because they didn't want either Trump or Hillary Clinton. We've got enough, Latino voters. We've got more than enough people who are oppressed economically and socially that we can be targeting. So, I actually did some campaigning. Speaking of Bernie, I did some campaigning, and this was in 2016 when we were trying to get Bernie to win Michigan. I am an activist, so I'm like a non-traditional. I wouldn't say I'm really a journalist per se. I'm a writer, because like my whole goal is to be involved with communities and to do activism.
It's like me. I'm really a talk show host / Bernie bro.
Yeah, theme of the night, guys. Yeah. We're all Bernie bros. And we were...
Don't act like that isn't going to get another call back. All right, but keep going.
So I was talking to a voter who voted for Obama. And so it does exist. It's a thing. And she was contemplating waffling between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And so I had to, give her my spiel. And she was like, okay, Bernie Sanders has my vote. So that... Right. Those people exist. They are swing voters. That is a thing. But I think Democrats, they tend to, just historically speaking, at least for the last maybe 40 or 50 years, they tend to think of identity as mutually exclusive from economic appeals. Right. So when they were trying to find their identity after Robert Kennedy's assassination, they swung all the way to just kind of identity exclusively. When they realized, okay, we lost the white vote to Richard Nixon, there's nothing we can do to get them back. We don't need to really talk about economics or economic justice or anything that could really appeal to them. And that framing is completely backwards. You've got these pendulum shifts or swings where you're going kind of between these white economic voters or relying on this economic justice platform for them, or you're excluding Black people, or you're talking about Black people and not really including people of all races who are dealing with economic injustice. So that is a key. That's going to be debilitating for Democrats for the immediate future if they don't get a hold of that, particularly on a national level, and they don't hold on to that conversation, hold on to that narrative the way that Donald Trump has successfully done. So I think they need to look at people, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, look at her win and Stacey Abrams' win as some models, because it can happen, other than Brian Kemp being an asshole and definitely stealing the election.
Yeah, we're going to actually have in the post game a guy who is an organizer for Vote Georgia is going to call in with an update on that. We're going to do some more talking about that. But just another follow-up. So I think that's absolutely true. And I think there's no, again, people need to get really real about the data that's accumulating about the Trump voter profile out of this election. And again, in some ways, as we keep saying, they're Republicans. It's not really that sophisticated, but whatever. But I do think in the long term, it's very dangerous that Democrats created a brand where they associated racial and gender progress with trash economics. I think that's really dangerous. And if those two things, because I do think that what some of this sort of resurgence of alt-right things, I think that some of what's happening is that some of these say very specifically say middle-class white guys are recognizing that actually in today's global economy and the way the economy is structured, you can't actually just get a free ride as a middle-class white guy anymore. You can't. It's just not the way it's structured. And so instead of going to socialism, they're going to well, what was the time where that shit was guaranteed. And that's an interest in things like apartheid politics, in my opinion, because that is when you had capitalism that was structured so that it was just completely racially insulated, right? So I think like in the long term, not election cycle by election cycle, but over the span of decades, if in people's minds they're always like, well, the party that is right on, you know, even just like gay rights and marriage equality is also the one that's saying like, fuck you, like, you don't code, you're useless. That toxifies progress in people's minds in a way. And I do think that's a longer term problem.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's also kind of an immediate problem in the sense that there are a lot of black voters who are already disillusioned.
Oh, well, definitely. I'm talking about the white people.
Okay, so white folks.
White people take, that's why I said long term. It takes a little bit longer.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking about that too. I was walking around on my lunch break, just randomly thinking about the future of capitalism in America. And it's a steady decline.
Right.
And we've been experiencing it first. You know how they say when America catches a cold, black people get the flu. Yep. So there's evidence of this already amongst us, and these are people who are, you know, staunchly Democrats. So if you can lose these people, imagine what happens with, you know, the general, you know, electoral body. Yeah. When you start seeing the ways that, I mean, you guys were talking about it, like New York City is getting more and more empty. We've got Long Island City that's going to be overrun by these tech bros. I love some of my tech bros. I dated a tech bro. Like, I get it.
Like a tech bro.
Who I also think was a little bit libertarian.
Was it
I was like,
a libertarian?
I kind of
I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. The interview's over.
I'm going to
kindly ask you to leave.
I shouldn't be talking about him because he's great.
I was simply trying to fix the culture in many ways.
You put on your headphones. Yeah, you just got owned by a sound drop. You gotta get your headphones on.
You missed the James Damore
My
drop.
bad.
Yeah, this is your ex-boyfriend, right?
I was simply trying to fix the culture in many ways.
Who's that?
That's
your
James Damore, the Google guy.
What Google guy? There's so many
He
Google
did the
guys.
Google memo that he got him fired.
For the sexual discrimination.
He said girls couldn't do computer coding.
Yeah.
He also dated you.
Him.
He dated you for a while.
Oh my God. I haven't heard that voice in so long.
Yeah. Should I order caviar?
So yeah, I mean, like Manhattan is just getting more and more, just unlivable for people who are even making six figures. So where are people going to go? What's going to happen? And that's across the board. So, black folks, we've been leaving for decades, the reverse migration back to, my city of Atlanta and, throughout the South. So what's going to happen with the rest of the country?
Final question before we go to the post game. To what extent, another thing I really liked about your piece, and I always it's just talking about like the black vote as one monolithic thing. And I'm not even saying I'm not making some PC point like, oh no, you can't. It's like, no, literally, like even in New York City, like the political tradition of Harlem is really different than Brooklyn, because there's a difference if you came to New York from the South versus, a Caribbean community. Like there's different politics, there's different incentives, there's different, and so many in these conversations, not just because obviously I wanted to push back and defend Bernie as a Bernie bro, but it was also like literally, you're wrong. I mean, we see this. There's a breakdown with like older black voters prefer Clinton, younger black voters prefer Bernie. You point out the South with a certain social conservatism, which reflects actually, in fact, all Southern voters. And that's also changing. We see that with Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum. And then this like Midwest populist black labor tradition. So to what extent do we also just need to, of course there's a black vote and there's overall black interests and black threats, certainly from something like the Trump administration. But it seems like people need to start figuring out how to disaggregate like voters inside the black community, right? Having very different interests, different ideological traditions, different politics. Is that going to help us get where we need to go? And also campaigns not be fucking morons and go to Wisconsin.
Yeah, and I think it'll help, mainstream Democrats, even though I'm not shilling for them. I don't really care if they improve because we need to get them out. So they can keep losing if they like to. If they want to treat black people as a monolith, keep losing. That's cool.
Right.
And I think it's important for people who identify as leftists as well. So when you think of working class, this piece is to push back on the narrative that it is, exclusively white, that it erases black people who do have a tradition of, like, we talked about before, collective bargaining, where they come from, kind of this anti-establishment politics. If you want to win, then yes, you're going to need to target these voters, and not because, you just want their vote, but because they're suffering. A lot of these folks have been dealing with capitalism, deindustrialization. I framed the piece around a factory called A.O. Smith, which is like the prime example of what happens when there is outsourcing and this race to the bottom in corporate governance. So they moved their operations to Mexico. They moved their operations to China. There are no more jobs left. The jobs that did remain in Milwaukee, they moved to the suburbs. So if you are not recognizing, that, so many black people are in these manufacturing industries, then you're also not recognizing the policy issues that you're going to need to address, like mass transit. How do you get people from the center city to suburbs?
Free universal mass transit.
Yes.
That needs to be central.
How do you have mass transit in these neighborhoods how do you even address the things that are within your purview if you don't even realize that it's an issue to begin with? So that is
Joy
kind of
Reid
a
was
wake-up
talking
call.
about this the other day.
Of course she was, right?
Yeah. I love how the hate for Joy Reid is so heavy that people don't even do like the pause. Like, really? She was talking about that? It's always like, yeah, of course she was. Okay.
Yeah, I think I re-followed her because of like one thing that I wanted to look at. I was like, okay, I'm done.
I think relative to most Bernie bros, I have been so easy on Joy Reid. It's amazing. People really don't like Joy Reid. I mean, she's trash. Don't get me wrong. I'm just like, whew.
It's MSNBC.
Just a one note.
What was that Bernie Sanders thing she did about him being like a college guy?
He's a bad roommate.
He's a bad roommate.
Which, I mean, I don't know.
Some
Hey,
serious
can I borrow your
investigation.
BitTorrent?
I swear I wasn't downloading.
I swear I was. Well, we have a strike notice from Verizon. It wasn't me. I'm tired of being
I
blamed.
think I'm the only one that downloads on this.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm the only guy because I'm the only one that's torrenting. Fuck you. All right.
If
maybe-
Joy Reid was doing that, that'd be good.
If
Twitter-
Joy Reid
Twitter
was
account.
doing a solid Bernie impression about him stealing Netflix passwords, I would give her a pass every single day. That's the type of broadcast talent that goes a long way with me. It's the same reason I like Alex Jones. All right. Remember when we betted Alex Jones dissing Ben Shapiro when we betted Ether under it and it worked?
I don't even remember why he dissed Ben Shapiro.
Oh, because Ben Shapiro's whack. He put out a track on Ben Shapiro and we betted Ether under it and it worked. It actually flowed.
Vetted Ether. I think this is like next level Bernie, bro. I'm not like all the way there. What is this? I'm curious.
So Ether, Nas's
Yes.
Jay-Z track.
Yes.
So we played.
Bunch of in-studio audience.
Yeah, you don't even
bunch
have to play the
of crew
video.
here.
Just you can play it on audio. We did this.
I mean,
Yeah, I don't have the ether on it though.
Oh, you don't have the Ether on it?
Oh, you said you embedded.
We put the Ether. We bedded the Ether instrumental
What's
under. It's just we just played the.
Okay. It's like
Jesus
new
Christ.
terminology.
It's Bernie bro inner sanctum terminology. No,
I see.
We just played the Ether instrumental while. Do you have this?
he tries to act scary and powerful.
See, it
he
works.
recycles a bunch of libertarian conservative thought and a bunch of other think tanks.
Okay. Cipher.
Yeah, exactly.